Two, three. Hello and welcome to Mystic Chat. So today we have a fabulous author. Is it Catherine or Catherine? I meant to ask you.
Catherine.
It's Catherine Carr. So, so Catherine has wrote this fabulous book called World Soul, and I was just saying I have a very selfish reason for talking about this book. So in my ministry as a pagan leader, I keep having uh, rabbis, ministers, and priests say, "Hey, I want to learn about paganism." So I thought that this book would be a fabulous resource for people. So I thought we'd talk about it. So my name is Chris Allen. I am a published author, a pagan minister, chaplain, and a healer, therapist, all the above. Uh, Laura, introduce yourself, please.
Hello, everybody. My name is Laura Gonzalez. I'm a minister and a priestess of the goddess. I'm a pagan witch and a Tisit. I'm a healer or curandera. I practice paganism and indigenous practices from Mexico. And I'm a teacher, I'm a writer, I'm an actor, I'm a model, and I'm also anxious all the time. So, hi! Thank you for being here. And I'm very happy because people have asked me about Mystic Chat. So you who ask about Mystic Chat, I hope you're watching it. Thank you. And I give it to my dear friend, Frater Aaron, to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Aaron. I am an original member of the Fellowship of the Phoenix and a graduate of the Mystery School of the Fellowship of the Phoenix. I'm a ceremonial magician and traditional witch, and the host of Storybook Sacred Lore of Witchcraft. And we are super happy to be talking with Catherine Carr. Hi, Catherine.
Hi, thank you, everyone.
So, Catherine, tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you? And why are you writing? What was the inspiration for that?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm also a pagan witch. I'm a Lokian witch specifically, and a writer. Books are kind of my main thing. They're my day job. And I reached the point in the last few years where it was time to start writing my own religious books. I come from a Catholic background, so there's a lot of systematic theology there, a lot of systematic, what do we believe and what are the implications of that. And I love what you said earlier, Chris, about being really interested in World Soul for interfaith purposes, because part
Mm-hmm.
of the thinking behind this book, there is a much longer draft that exists, but I was getting a lot of questions from people that I was like, I want to be able to give people something that is less than 200 pages, that has a really solid foundation in what makes pagan traditions, as far as the ones I know, different from Christianity and Islam, because so many people think that those are all religion and theology, and they actually have some teachings that are kind of unique on the world stage. So,
It's interesting because, when I went uh, to graduate school to do hospital chaplaincy, and when you do chaplaincy, you're considered like a pastoral therapist, and you don't really talk about
mhm.
God or goddess. You just talk about you. And so a lot of people told me, hey, when you're in divinity school, you need to keep your head down and don't say anything because, don't draw attention to yourself because you don't want all that hate towards you. And I found the opposite to be true. I found that the more educated people are, even if they're fundamental or they're evangelical, at least they're curious and having conversations about paganism.
Mhm.
And when I was at Parliament of World Religions, and Laura, I'm sure you had the same experience. It was so gratifying to have people say, "Oh, tell me about paganism. Tell me about that." And
Mhm.
it was hard. I was so excited to read your book because it was hard because, oh, what beginner book should I use?
Mhm.
But that doesn't treat me as an idiot, you know? And I was
Mhm.
like, oh. Okay, and there's a few books I recommend. This one I particularly like because it kind of meets people where they're at, and I really appreciated that.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, it was a very interesting undertaking because my other thing is I've I've heard a lot of people express some frustration with books that take, one pagan tradition's theology and say this is all pagan theology. So my approach in writing this was what can I say that is pretty true of all the traditions that I know of. And that just, automatically led to a more complex discussion and kind of a more scholarly discussion where we were looking at, not just this is the way it is theologically, but this is the way different people think of it.
Right.
And these are the complexities around that.
Um, Laura, what questions you have? I know I see the hamster wheel going.
The hamster wheel is always going. I would like to ask Catherine because if I remember, you mentioned you grew up in a different organized religion. Correct me if
Yeah,
I'm wrong.
yeah.
Okay. So I'm gonna show my soul as I usually do on these shows. I grew up Catholic, so there's a lot of trauma from
Mm-hmm.
growing up Catholic. And
Mm-hmm.
now as a pagan and more so into reintegrating my indigenous practices and all of that, there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of resentment, there's a lot of, and I pride myself by saying I'm an interfaith minister and I try to
Mm-hmm.
welcome all religions, all peoples, etc. But the wound from the trauma is there. How do we save the
Yeah,
world when we are confronted with, because that's part of the shadow, right? That's part of our
yeah,
uh,
yeah.
the work that we do. So how do you reconcile that upbringing with doing the work of writing so objectively this book?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because one thing that I find makes it easier for me at least is responding to people the way they respond to me. Because there are Catholics and Christians who are very open to pagan ideas, or at least not, violently rejecting and trying to get rid of us from existence. And at Parliament, I was privileged to meet a lot of those. I do, have a lot of anger and trauma myself from, things I saw within the Catholic Church, things I saw within other conservative Christian denominations, but I'm very careful throughout this book to say that some strains of, Christianity teach this and that because I have been blessed to have positive experiences with Christians who are more supportive and even have more similar ideas to our own. One of the whole things I talked about in World Soul was the Conference for Women's Ordination, which is big on highlighting parts of the Bible that a lot of churches don't talk about very much.
Hmm.
And so I still definitely, I express the anger in certain circumstances where it is brought to me, but I also find that the people who are really bringing that anger themselves, like, oh, how dare you, are not usually going to interfaith spaces. And there's so many, multitudes within Christianity I'm very careful to talk about what some strains teach, because for anything you can say Christianity teaches, there are going to be some Christians that don't agree with that.
Mhm. One of the things that I I'm a firm believer of if it's broke, let's fix it, in the sense
Mm-hmm.
of exactly what you said in the Bible, how there are things we don't talk about. And it's like, oh, we can talk about being gay or women being considered less than and the patriarchy and blah blah blah, uh, but they cherry pick things.
Mm-hmm.
And One of the things I can appreciate is I have a very good friend who um, is Jewish, and he talks about that in his synagogues that they actually talk about the problems and how they can
Mm,
fix it in the modern society. That I think is great. I think if we don't acknowledge things and heal, we're not going to help each other. We're not going to help our
yeah,
own faith.
yeah.
Um, and at the same time, there's aspects of a Wicca and paganism that are problematic, and I think we need to address, because
Mhm.
it's the whole thing about of requiring some traditions require you to be sky clad to do ritual. I think is I've said it once, I'll say it again, predatorial. I think that if that's something that you enjoy, I think it's great. You do you. But if you're a little conservative or shy, or frankly, don't want people seeing you naked, it shouldn't be a problem. And
Mhm.
I want to have those conversations. And I, one of the things that I speak out against is it's always been this way. This is a tradition.
Mhm.
So is the patriarchy, and we're changing that.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Yeah,
what are
one of
some signs to look for in a person's religious environment to look out for, whether it's coming from a Christian environment, a patriarchal environment, a neo-pagan environment? Like, what are some of the symptoms that you might say people should be conscious of?
Mhm. I guess we should ask who that question was addressed to. I think Chris and I are looking at each other.
Oh, sure. And I'm not sure if I asked it in a great way or not, but furthermore, to make sure that
Yeah.
it's going to be in a healthy relationship with yourself and towards your own safety and your own beliefs. But I'd love to hear your take on it, Kristen. Catherine.
Yeah, I have actually come to a point where I have figured out why homophobia is such a red flag for me in religions, because I have felt for a long time like it's a problem in and of itself, but I also feel like it signals deeper issues. And I feel like what it signals is this religious group's willingness to tell you that, you're doing it wrong. We don't care if it's not hurting anyone. We don't care if it's, beneficial in all of these ways. We don't like it, so we're going to tell you not to do it. So that's one thing I tell Christians a lot. I say, if your church is homophobic, that for me is a red flag that there are other problems about the ways in which they are willing to tell you how to live your life and be dogmatic in that approach. I'm really big on consent culture. That's something I was actually pleased to be able to talk about in World Soul, because it's something that we hear about in like the sex education arena, but it's such a wider cultural thing, where this idea that people should be able to freely choose what they do and make their own choices. And that's something that I find very compatible with pagan theology, because in pagan traditions, the individual is often the locus of divine manifestation, and it's not like there's this priesthood and they're the only ones who know everything. And so I was really pleased to be able to write about that in a religious context in World Soul, and how I see that affecting, the kinds of people we see in pagan circles who maybe might not have felt welcome in a lot of the other kinds of religious congregations that are available.
I'm curious because I found every chapter to be very of rich, and you have a style I appreciate. Like you had an edge, and I mean that in the best possible, wonderful way. Like you were very unapologetic. And my first instinct was, "Ooh, the patriarchy's not gonna like this voice," and I thought it was fabulous. Um, I think that we need more voices who have an edge like yours. because when I say edge, it doesn't mean like rah. It means listen, I'm talking.
Yeah, yeah.
The women are talking now. Sit down. And I love it. I live for that shit.
Thank
If you can think about one or two things that you really want the audience to hit home with this book, what would those two things be?
Oh gosh, that's a tough one.
Um,
You
I
know,
know.
World still had as many chapters as it had because I was like, okay, what are all the things I need to talk about? There's like 13 of them. Um, I guess I would say that times when you're looking for this book is folks, a lot of it is written specifically to address questions of people who are new to paganism. You know, I see people ask theology questions in pagan groups all the time
Mhm.
where I can tell that they are coming from a Christian or Muslim background and they are still being surprised to find that there are theologies that don't have certain ideas, and also people who are not pagan but are like, hey, can you explain to me what this is, because that is another thing that the book is very specifically made for. It's like, how can we cover what I consider to be a lot of the most important bases in a relatively short page count. Now, I'm told that it's not necessarily a short reading experience because a lot of people are like, "Wow, I had to stop and think about that chapter for a while," but it's a shorter page count, so you're not, recommending someone a 500-page tome. And yeah, there are a lot of things I would love to talk about, like specific issues, but I don't know if I could pick one or two that I feel like are the most important takeaways.
Um, one of the things I really liked about the book is what is God and what it is and isn't to us. You know,
Yeah, yeah.
can you talk about that a little bit? Like what? Yeah, just
Yeah, yeah. So there are kind of two ways that I feel like I approach that conversation in this book. One is the actual word theos,
mhm.
because I was fascinated when I was researching this book. I would find study Bibles that had footnotes that said things like, they use the same word to refer to the true God and the false God, so don't let that confuse you. And that really got me into, what is the definition of a God with a small g, a God with a big G, and that gets into really interesting cross cultural things because there are a lot of religions that believe in entities that kind of have aspects of both, but you don't hear about that from monotheistic theologians. And so the discussion of what is theos, what does the big G versus the small g God mean, was really interesting to me because they do have different characteristics that are important for how people relate to the gods. The other thing that was interesting was that for every religion I looked at, there are both pantheistic and non pantheistic versions, which I found so interesting because it's like this question of where is God? What is the locus of God? Is God inside us? Is God inside all living things? Is God inside all material things? Or is God off in some traditions literally in a box somewhere that is separate from the world, and the world doesn't get that, divine, sacred, and spiritedness? And that was so interesting because it came up, there are pantheistic and non-pantheistic strains of Judaism, of Islam, of Christianity. I feel like paganism leans toward the pantheistic, toward locating the divine in the material world, which is one of the things I really like about it, because if our religious thought is telling us, oh, none of this stuff that is around us right now and none of these people that are around us right now are good enough, and again, God is better and above everything, then what are we doing? So I'm a big fan of the pantheism, and a friend of mine put it very succinctly when I was explaining this to her. She said, so it depends on how centralized you like your God, like how distributed. And I'm like, yeah, I'm a very distributed God kind of person. So
One of my favorite sayings in, I don't know, life literature. I never read it. I heard it. Uh, God created man, and man returned the favor. As if, God created humans, and then we anthropomorphize all of the beautiful creations of the
Mhm.
creator into all these entities that have qualities and attributes and flaws and desires just like us. But even within paganism, you sometimes get uh pantheist people that are like, no, it's not one god, it's a million of them.
Mhm.
How do you think that is kind of like the same issue that happens in all religions? Since you mentioned that all of them have
Yeah.
this pantheistic and none.
Yeah, that's an interesting question because I do have a section in World Soul as well about the hard versus the soft polytheism. And that's a real interesting discussion because I can see advantages to both and I can see flaws that I see in both types of pagan communities. So I think they really support each other well. But that's an interesting question because with monotheists, it's really easy to see, right, that you're saying that only this one thing is God. And if you're saying, my God is very, my many gods are very distinct individuals that are separate from other things. Is that the same impulse, or is that one way I almost read it sometimes is, and I think this is a strength of the really hard polytheists, is kind of a respect for the individual divinities because one of the issues I see sometimes in the softer polytheists is saying, oh, it's really all the same thing. So, the specifics of this tradition or this deity aren't as important. And I'm like, how about no? Like,
Because in the Aztec, so-called Aztec belief system, there is one that turned into two, that turned into four, that turns into like 4,000.
yeah.
So and they are always, or I shouldn't say always, because we cannot speak in absolutes, but quite often they are an unfolding of each other. And when it has this and those qualities, is one aspect, one name. And then when it lacks one of those qualities, it's another aspect, another name. So I guess the rule applies only when we truly understand, right, the differences. But I
Yeah.
get it, I get it. Someone that is perhaps very like about from Loki, right? You cannot say, oh, Loki is the same as fill the blank, because
Yeah. Yeah.
no. Like when people tell me, oh, that's Hermes, and I'm like, no, hey,
Yeah.
but it's
Oh,
Hermes. No.
yeah. There's some writings about the Norse that were done by Romans where they just use Roman names for the gods, and you're like, I cannot even tell who you're referring to right now. Like,
Exactly.
who is Hermes in this Northern European context? Could be several people, but
Could we follow like through with that a little more and talk about, or hear you talk about how you discuss the kind of the history of how gender's been applied to God and then to us?
yeah, yeah, that's such an interesting conversation because almost all of the major world religions, like Christianity and Islam very much included, technically teach that God contains and transcends all genders. If they have the infinite God teaching, they have the teaching that God must contain all things. And there are places in the scriptures and the theology where they are very careful to specify that. But the way in which that has been lost in practical application is so telling. Because I talk to Christians and Muslims all the time who say, they believe that God is literally a dude. And not in the biological sense, obviously, but they'll be like, no, obviously God is a man. And I'm like, but have you talked to your own like highest level theologians about that? Because they will probably tell you otherwise. So it's really interesting to see how patriarchy creeps into things, and it's not even just the monotheistic faiths. There are other religions that have had the same thing happen, and I have a whole chapter on the economics of why I think that happens. But in paganism, I think one of the reasons that I see I'm Lokian, and there are a lot of trans Lokians. Like, it's a very trans heavy tradition, And I think one of the reasons for that is that the pagan traditions, and some pagan traditions specifically, have explicit manifestations of gods that actually are unequivocally all genders. You've got your gods, you've got your goddesses, you've got a lot of gender fluid deities, and like not fitting anywhere on the binary deities. So I think that is why a lot of the characteristics I see, especially of Lokian congregations, happen. And I think that, you know, the ancients knew a thing or two about the value of looking at the divine in all the genders, and in genders that maybe we're not sure these are fixed genders, but there's something going on there. So
I think these are very important conversations to have. And I feel like in our society, if we take, 2 steps forward and 7 steps back sometimes, and it just becomes, frustrating. Um, can I agree? So, some more research like ancient cultures like the Babylons and
mm-hmm.
the Greco-Romans, Egyptians, and the Native American and indigenous people and so forth. Even the what we think of as the hyper masculine Vikings and Nordics, that um, there were they didn't have a term for bisexuality, it was just sexuality, and they also
Mm-hmm.
didn't have. I mean, one of the things I read about like a, a Greek society is that other than procreation and for the heir of this or the heir of that property, if you wanted to dress in a skirt and sing a song, so if you were genetically female and when wanted to pick up a sword and go into battle, great, we need your help. It This whole idea of like, I feel like the patriarchy is all about categories.
Mm-hmm.
Sin, not sin, good, bad, light, dark, evil, holy, male, female. And I feel like these categories have become the white man's way of dominating other people. And I really like the idea and the conversation of the reason why white men are afraid of Black people having power is because they're afraid to be treated how we treated them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that paganism, especially books like yours, because I really love the chapter on the whole gender thing and what does that mean and who are we? Um, you know, I think that to be, if you want equality, you have to be a strong feminist.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if we want equality in religion, I think you have to honor the goddess. I just do. I
Mm-hmm.
think that if you're not at least learning, I don't think you have to serve the goddess per se. I mean, I do, but I don't think you have to. But I think that once you understand and what the goddess is, what the goddess does,
Mm-hmm.
how does she feel, how does she transform, how does she give birth, how does she kill, how does she do all these things, then and only then can you understand what equality kind of, kind of,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Oh my God, Chris Allen, I loved you. Now I love you even more. And of course, we all know I'm Team Goddess. But the other thing that we have to take in account when we talk about research and papers and what has been discovered and this and that is the stories are always written by the colonizer or the winner. And so we have instances in which we have all this wonderful amount of research about the goddess, instilled is denied that the matriarchal societies existed. And I'm not gonna say which book because, where I don't want to single out one particular author, especially because I love the book. But that one part where they deny that, like, there were no, because there's no research that in a paper that says there were matriarchal traditions. And I'm like, we are living entities that know that these things happen, that we have matriarchal traditions or true equally important male, female, and other traditions and cultures, but also because research such as the immense work done by Maria Gimbutas is just brushed off because she was, I'm quoting the patriarchal people that dismissed her, because she was a historical woman. And I'm like, no, this women literally unearthed the pieces and went and talked to the people and learned from the song and the dance. And so the goddess has been there for forever, right? So it is dismissed by academia because academia oftentimes is ruled by colonization tendencies, where patriarchy is what dominates. And I will say it until I die. Colonizers did to themselves first, but they then came and did in America, the continent of America. So yeah, it's kind of good, like not kind of, it's really, really good to have somebody that has this academic point of view that can also speak for things that have been erased by academia. And that is the truth. I mean, sorry. Like, I love academia because they're the record keepers. But also it's like
Yeah.
good erasing the divine.
One of the things that is scary is that part of my background is in clinical research, where they have very specific research best practices. That they're like, if you don't use these best practices, you're not going to get accurate results of your studies. And that's very bad when you're researching things like how to have people not die. But when you look at the history of scientific research, we only really started having those best practices in like the 70s. And I think there's a reason that all of a sudden all of this feminist scholarship started coming out in the 70s, because before that there's so much, like, the scholars are just projecting so much of their own worldview and overlooking so many things because they're not using these best practices, that it's ridiculous. Like, there's this famous origin of the idea that, men were the hunters and providers, this study called Man the Hunter. And it's fascinating because if you look at it, first of all, the research methods are terrible, and since then people have gone back and been like, no, that was not accurate at all. And secondly, it cracks me up because they call it Man the Hunter because this was the priority of the male scientists. But then you look at their own analyses and it's like, yeah, like 80% of the people's calories were coming from like hunter-gatherer plant-based labor, and like 20% of the calories were coming from the hunting. But the scientists still thought that like this was the most important takeaway because they liked hunting, I guess. So when you get to, and the other thing is, we now know that isn't true at all, because after that, all these archaeologists started going, oh, well, if they're buried with hunting implements, clearly it's a man. And that was how they were deciding what the gender of skeletons was. And then, like, in the last decade or so, people started going back and being like, we understand how hormones influence skeletal development now, so let's see what the actual genders. Oh gosh, like a third of these hunters and warriors were genetically female. That's interesting. So that's, the power of good research methods, which to a larger extent than most people think, I think we just didn't have before the 70s. There are all these horror stories from the clinical research world that happened before the 70s because these things just weren't codified, and it's really interesting.
And
I think,
sorry, just one more
go
idea. I'm
ahead.
so sorry. All the figurines, all the statues, and all the female figures were always labeled as the wife of, the sister of, the daughter of, or the priestess of, in rare occasions. It was never she's the warrior, she's the, But anyway, of my
No, I think those are important things to say because, um, even, you know, I've been talking about all weekend how I think that a lot of the assist game and don't support in reality uh, trans people, and I don't think they. I think a lot of people, just men in general, like just cis men, just don't talk about or support women, gays, trans people. I think it's all on paper. I think they can read. Anyone can hit share, but I don't see a lot of people actually raising up their actual voice and saying things and things like that. There's a few, I think. So I know that there are people who are helping, but I don't think there's a lot. So I think it's important to have these conversations and these realizations. And it's important that I'm glad, uh, Catherine, you talk about, well, when you do research, it needs A, B, and C, because I don't think
Mhm.
a lot of people understand that. I don't think a
Yeah.
lot of people really know. And even that, then we make mistakes and things like that. So we've been talking about a lot of our I think about it. Catherine, I have a question for you. When it comes to paganism, when it comes to this theology, what, how does paganism give you joy?
That is a great question, Chris. My experience was very interesting because I was raised Catholic and I was considered a very devout Catholic for my entire childhood. Like I was more into it than my parents to an extent. And then around the time I hit puberty, I started to realize that wait, the religious experiences that I'm having do not match the religious experiences that my churchmates are having at all. And it became more and more clear because I got a specific goddess calling when I was like 11 or 12. Still, probably the most powerful religious experience I have had in my life. And that was a very interesting point because I was very young and I was dealing with this question of, well, what do I do if I just had what I recognize as a very powerful religious experience, but all of the religious leaders around me are telling me, nah, that's not legit. You must be confused. So, from that point on, I think that started a lot of my really delving into what the Catholic Church teaches, which part of the reason I have the edge is that I've had a lot of Catholics try to tell me, no, no, this is what the church really teaches. I'm like, honey, I've read the Summas. I promise I know what your church teaches, and it's not always that consistent. But so it was really validating in my 20s for me to I left my hometown, which didn't have a lot of public pagan representation that you could find, and I find out that there are these people who are doing these things I've been naturally inclined to do all my life, and they're called pagans. And so it's been really a way for me to be my full self because I've always had this religious calling that just I could not, by the time I left Christianity, I could not shoehorn into any of the Christian denominations I had encountered. So that's another reason I'm really passionate about this work because I think a lot of people gain a lot from, communing with their divine selves and the divinity in the world. And I think the religions that are most common in America right now they actively have guardrails on to stop people from doing that. And that's this whole interesting thing because, like, back in the 60s, even, they started to notice that as attendance in organized churches was dropping, self reported religious experiences were actually going up. And I feel
Hmm.
like that's something we continue to see and explore in in paganism because we don't have these authorities to tell us, oh, your religious experience is just wrong and like you're confused. So I think that's why there's a big blossoming going on right now because, religion is a natural human function, and the way that the Christian churches, for example, are doing it seems to be specifically constructed to exclude some of the ways that that happens.
I think that's a control thing. I do because, Um, it's interesting, and I'm not going to talk too long about this. When I write my own books, I write about, here's the research, here's the Lord, here's my own experience. And I'll say, this is my experience.
Mhm.
And then people are like, oh, but that's not the lore. Oh, that's not the
Mhm.
mythology. Oh, well, that's not what Silver Ravenwolf said. And I'm like, yes, all those things are great, but I'm sharing it's like a
Mhm.
science experiment. I'm not trying to regurgitate someone else's experiment. I'm giving you mine. And people, I think, are so on one hand, I think that there's a whole lot of crazy people and charlatans in paganism. I'm just gonna say
Mhm.
it. I did too, and so people are hesitant to believe the research. That's why the thing I like about academia is you have qualified people who verify your results. And I
Mhm.
think in paganism, we need to start doing that. We need to have instead of having Amazon reviews, well, we need to have peer reviews. And
Mhm.
I do think the public's voice is important. I really do. I think we should be open and listen. But there's a difference between let's have people who know what they're doing talk about these things at the same time listening to people
Mhm.
who don't have our experience. But just because you're loud doesn't mean you know everything. But at the same time, I, I think UPG is important. I don't think one person's UPG changes mythology for everyone, but two or 300,
Mhm.
maybe it does. Maybe,
Mhm.
because who's to say the gods don't evolve too? Um, yeah, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting concept. One of the things that I feel like we keep coming back to here is about, academic scholarship being imperfect as a way of transferring information. And it's, I really do think people underestimate the extent to which that is the case, because I am a huge fan of academic scholarship and the peer review system. But even within in Lokian spaces, for example, there's a bunch of folklore and archaeology about Loki that isn't in the Eddas. So the mainline heathens largely don't know about them, and that's why Loki's Weirdlings runs a whole Loki university where they're looking specifically at these things that don't make it into like the short list of required scholarly reading for heathenism. The question of having like a peer-reviewed UPG system, I think that could be really interesting. I am already picturing the power plays that would happen. Which one of the things that's interesting is pagan leadership politics is so much like Christian leadership politics, having been in both.
True.
Um,
Or maybe
but
worse.
but I think it would be really interesting to have a systematic time and space to compare UPG. And sometimes I think to a small degree the internet does function that way. Like with Loki's Weirdlings, the community, it's particularly interesting because there are 2,000 people in that group at this point that all have very similar UPG, and that's been a self-selecting thing where we kind of found each other. But making more space for that, I think, would be good because the attitude I so often hear is either, UPG isn't useful or like this one person's UPG needs to be the whole thing. So I
Right.
think that would be a really refreshing proposal.
We have come to the end of our time, and I'm very, 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 very sad because I love having these fun pagan theological discussions. I can do this all day long. Um, uh, Lord, you show us what you're holding up.
I am holding
Somebody was
on
coming through the radio, but I couldn't tell who it
this
was.
book called World Soul, uh, Healing Ourselves and the Earth Through Pagan Theology, from the one and only Catherine Carr, who is the person you were hearing to a minute ago. And yeah, I have to put my 2 cents. You know this. I think in the order of being diverse in our pagan community, we have opened the doors a little too wide,
Hmm.
and there's nobody checking in who's in and who's out. And if I said it once, I said it again. If you have UPG because you hear something with your mind's ears and you saw something with your mind's eyes and you feel it inside of you, then that is, in my opinion, a spiritual experience. But if you saw it with your eyes and if you hear it with your ears, please go to the psychiatrist because there's probably something that is not functioning correctly. And we have to take care of ourselves. Particularly before we start telling people, yes, you can see these things, you can hear these things. And then we start building fear. And then we suddenly come up with the medicine to ease those fears. That is my biggest pet peeve. As Chris said earlier, with all these people who are taking advantage of people. So good people exist in all religions, bad people exist in all religions, and not even good and bad, but people who are unethical, you know. So let's be very, very careful on
Mhm.
who we take water from.
Catherine, before we go, are there any final words you might have for us?
Oh, goodness. Well, I appreciate everyone's time, and I'm sure I have too many things to say. But World Soul is available right now on Amazon. It's got a bookstore availability coming up. And yeah, thank all you lovely people for your time. I'm a big admirer of all of your work, so it's great to be here with all of you, and great to engage in these conversations, which I would also be happy to keep doing for much longer.
Laura, would you like to say some final words?
I think I just say all my final words earlier, but I want to say again to Catherine Carr that not only she's a great writer, but she's also a great human.
Hmm.
And as a disabled person who needed a lot of help during Parliament of the World Religions, Catherine more than once offered to be my hands and my feet. And I will forever be grateful to Catherine for that. And the world needs to know the kind of
Oh, that's
wonderful human that you are. So thank you.
that is so sweet. Aaron, final words.
Just it was an honor to hear you all share, and especially you, Catherine. And I hope to talk to everyone again.
All right. I want to say thank you to our host and especially Catherine. This has been fabulous. I've really enjoyed all of this, and we shall see you all soon. So, you all have a good night. Be well, be healthy, and be safe. And I'm going to try to turn this off and do it without breaking something. Night.